On December 30th, 2003, Hong Kong woke up to the kind of news that makes a city feel suddenly smaller, colder, and unbearably quiet. Anita Mui was dead. She was only 40 years old. For months, the public had known she was ill, but knowledge is not the same thing as acceptance. People had seen her grow weaker, had watched her continue to perform, had heard the rumors and the medical reports. Yet her death still landed like a shock. Anita Mui was not just another singer or actress. She was one of the faces that helped define Hong Kong itself. Glamorous, rebellious, emotional, untouchable, and somehow deeply human at the same time. That is why her death felt bigger than private grief. It felt civic. It felt cultural. It felt like a whole era had been forced to stop and look at its own ending. The woman once called the Queen of Cantopop was gone, and the city that had watched her rise from hardship into myth suddenly had to face the reality that even icons can die in public, piece by piece, while the whole world watches. What made the loss even more haunting was that Anita had not disappeared quietly before the end. She had stood in front of her audience and sung through the pain. She had done what legends do when they feel time collapsing around them. She turned the stage into a final battlefield. By late 2003, her illness was no longer hidden. The signs were visible in her body, in her breath, in the fragility behind the makeup and costumes. And still she performed. Still she faced the lights. Still, she gave the public one more version of strength even as her body was running out of it. That is what makes Anita Mui's ending so devastating. It was not simply death. It was a farewell unfolding in real time, with music playing over it. The audience did not know exactly how close the end was, but looking back now, the final performances feel almost unbearable to watch. She was not merely entertaining. She was saying goodbye with every ounce of life she had left. And that is why Anita Mui's story cannot begin only with fame, or even with illness. To understand why her death hit Hong Kong so hard, we have to understand the woman behind the crown. We have to go back before the sold-out concerts, before the bold costumes, before the film roles, before the title Queen of Cantopop ever belonged to her. Because Anita was not born into glamour. She was shaped by survival. Long before the public saw a fearless superstar, there was a little girl singing because life gave her no softer option. The ending hurt because the woman who died in 2003 had spent a lifetime transforming pain into performance. And if the final chapter looked like tragedy, it was only because the whole story had always contained that same fight between the body and the will, between suffering and the stage, between the person fading and the legend refusing to. Long before Hong Kong knew her as Anita Mui, before the sequins, before the sold-out arenas, before the title Queen of Cantopop turned her into a legend, she was a little girl singing because her family needed money. That detail matters more than any glamorous image that came later, because it shaped the emotional truth of her life from the beginning. Anita was not born into a world that allowed her to dream slowly. Her father died when she was young, and the family struggled. Childhood for many people is the time when play comes before labor. For Anita, performance came early, and not as fantasy, but as survival. She and her older sister were pushed toward the stage while still very young, singing in nightclubs and lounges long before most children even understand what work truly is. That kind of beginning changes a person. It teaches discipline before innocence has finished forming. It teaches endurance before comfort. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches a child that applause is not always love. Sometimes it is simply how a family gets through another night. Anita did not enter entertainment from a distance. She was raised inside it, under smoke, lights, adult spaces, and the pressure to keep going. That early life created the woman the world would later find so magnetic. Anita learned to hold a stage before she was old enough to own a normal childhood. She learned how to watch people, how to read a room, how to project strength even when life gave her very little softness to stand on. There is something almost brutal in that image. A young girl surrounded by adults, singing not because she has already chosen a destiny, but because circumstance has chosen it for her. Yet within that hardship, something powerful was forming. Anita did not become merely tough. She became expressive. The stage trained her, but it also gave her a place to transform pain into presence. By the time she entered the New Talent Singing Awards in 1982, she was not a beginner stepping nervously into the spotlight. She was already carrying years of invisible labor in her body. Winning that competition did not create Anita Mui out of nowhere. It revealed her to a larger world. The little girl who had once sung to survive suddenly became visible as someone with the force to become a star. And maybe that is why her rise felt so inevitable afterward. She had already lived through too much not to turn it into something larger. That is also why Anita's story feels different from the stories of stars who are born into comfort and then shaped by fame. Fame did not invent Anita. Struggle did. Before the records, before the films, before the costumes and the myth, There was a child learning how to turn hunger, instability, and emotional absence into performance. And once you understand that, you begin to understand the deeper sadness of her ending too. Anita spent her whole life making strength visible. That strength looked glamorous later, but it began in hardship. It began with a little girl who had no choice but to keep singing. The public would one day fall in love with her boldness, her rebellion, her charisma, and her emotional force. But all of those qualities were rooted in something much more basic and much more painful. She had learned early that stopping was not an option. Before she became a queen, Anita Mui was a child trying to outsing the life that had cornered her. And once that kind of survival becomes part of someone's soul, it never fully leaves them, not even at the very end. When Anita Mui finally stepped into the spotlight as a rising star, she did not look like someone asking for permission. She looked like someone who had already paid too much to be ignored. After winning the New Talent Singing Awards in 1982, her rise moved quickly, but it never felt accidental. Anita had something more dangerous than talent alone. She had command. The moment she began to dominate Cantopop, it became clear that she was not going to fit neatly into the image of a polite, decorative female singer. She was too bold for that, too emotionally forceful, too willing to reshape the stage around her own body and presence. In an era when female stars could still be expected to soften themselves for public comfort, Anita moved in the opposite direction. She gave audiences glamour, yes, but also defiance. She could be sensual without apology, dramatic without losing control, vulnerable without becoming weak. And because she had been forged through hardship long before fame arrived, she did not wear power like costume. She wore it like memory. That is why her rise felt so electric. Anita Mui was not simply becoming famous. She was becoming the kind of woman who makes an entire culture rethink what a female star can be. As her music career exploded, Anita's image became inseparable from the emotional landscape of Hong Kong itself. She was not just releasing songs, she was creating eras. The costumes, the reinventions, the live performances, the voice heavy with ache and steel, everything about her felt larger than ordinary pop success. She earned the title Queen of Cantopop, not because the press needed a dramatic headline, but because she truly dominated the imagination of the public. Anita could fill a stage with heat, danger, sorrow, or tenderness depending on what a song needed, and she did it with the instincts of someone who understood that performance is not just about sound. It is about surrender, control, and myth. She also had something else that made her unforgettable: nerve. She was willing to challenge traditional ideas of femininity, to experiment with fashion, to carry androgyny and seduction at the same time, and to become visually iconic in a way that made imitation inevitable. But music was only part of her power. Anita crossed into film with the same force. In movies, she proved that her charisma was not limited to the concert stage. She could act with depth, fragility, and intelligence, and roles in films like Rouge helped reveal the emotional sophistication beneath the glamour. She was no longer just a singer who acted, or an actress who sang. She was becoming one of the rare Hong Kong stars who could command both industries without dividing herself between them. That is why Anita's rise has to be understood as more than career success. By the height of her fame, she had become a symbol of female power, of artistic fearlessness, of Hong Kong modernity, of beauty sharpened by pain rather than softened by comfort. She stood for transformation. She stood for survival dressed as spectacle, and perhaps that is what made her so beloved. Audiences did not only admire Anita Mui, they believed in her. They saw in her someone who had fought her way onto the stage and then refused to become small for anyone once she got there. But that kind of greatness comes with a cost. To become an icon is to be watched constantly, judged endlessly, and expected to remain larger than life even while carrying an ordinary human body underneath the image. By the time Anita had conquered music and film alike, the public no longer saw only a person. It saw legend, and legends are loved differently. They are asked to be stronger, brighter, more untouchable than anyone really can be. Anita gave the world that illusion with extraordinary brilliance. But hidden inside that triumph was the first shadow of the ending to come. Because the same woman who had turned pain into power for decades would one day have to stand before the public, carrying a pain even power could no longer hide. By 2003, the legend of Anita Mui had already been built. She had conquered music, film, fashion, and public imagination. But what makes her story so devastating is that the final chapter did not arrive in secret. It arrived in public. When Anita revealed that she was suffering from cervical cancer, the news changed the way people looked at her overnight. Suddenly, the body that had once seemed so powerful on stage was no longer protected by myth. Illness has a cruel way of stripping icons back down to flesh, pain, and time. But Anita did not respond by disappearing. She did something far more haunting. She kept performing. That decision is at the center of her tragedy. Many stars retreat when their bodies begin to fail them. Anita walked directly into the spotlight instead, as if refusing to let sickness decide the shape of her ending. The public could see that she was weakening. The glamour was still there, the costumes were still there, the voice was still there, but underneath it all was a visible fragility that made every performance feel heavier than applause could hold. That is what made the final concert so unforgettable. They were not simply live shows, they were acts of defiance. Anita stood before her audience not as the untouchable Queen of Cantopop from years past, but as a woman whose body was already fighting a war it might not win. And still, she sang. Still, she gave them drama, control, emotion, and that unmistakable aura only she possessed. Looking back, those performances feel almost unbearable because the bravery inside them is inseparable from the pain. She was not performing from a place of comfort or illusion. She was performing from the edge. Every breath seemed to matter. Every song felt loaded with something larger than entertainment. This is what makes Anita Mui's ending so different from so many other celebrity tragedies. She did not vanish before the public could understand what was happening. She let them witness her becoming mortal, and then turned that exposure into one last form of power. The stage had carried her since childhood, and now, in the final stretch of her life, it became the place where she faced death without looking away. Nothing captures that better than the image of Anita in white, dressed almost like a bride, singing Sunset Melody as if she were marrying the stage itself. It is one of the most haunting farewell images in Asian pop history because it feels like both surrender and refusal at once. She looked fragile, but the symbolism was enormous. The woman who had given her life to performance seemed to be offering herself to it one last time, not as victory, but as farewell. And that is the hidden cruelty of this chapter. Anita had spent her whole life transforming pain into spectacle, but now the pain was greater than the spectacle could fully conceal. The audience saw courage. They saw beauty. They saw a queen still standing. What they were really seeing was a final countdown disguised as a concert. By then, the question was no longer whether Anita Mui was ill. The question was how long a woman could keep turning suffering into song before the body finally asked for silence. On December 30th, 2003, Anita Mui died in Hong Kong at the age of 40. By then, the public had already been watching the final chapter unfold with a mix of denial and dread, but death still arrived with a force that no one was emotionally ready to meet. The woman who had once seemed unstoppable on stage, who had survived poverty, reinvention, scandal, pressure, and illness, was suddenly gone. And what made it even more painful was that her ending did not feel distant from the people who loved her. It felt intimate. They had seen her weakened body. They had heard the strain in her voice. They had watched her stand in front of them anyway, as if sheer will might delay the inevitable. So when the news finally broke, it did not feel like the closing of a headline. It felt like the breaking of something personal. Anita Mui had spent her whole life giving the public strength, glamour, and defiance. In the end, all that was left was silence, and Hong Kong did not know how to accept it. The funeral turned that silence into something visible. Thousands of fans lined up for one final chance to say goodbye, and the mourning that followed did not look like ordinary celebrity grief. It looked like collective heartbreak. People came with flowers, black clothing, tears, and the stunned expressions of those who were not just grieving a star, but someone who had become woven into the emotional identity of the city itself. Fellow artists came, friends came, admirers came. The streets filled, and the atmosphere carried a strange mix of grandeur and devastation. Anita had lived like a queen, and in death, the public farewell reflected that scale. But what made the funeral so haunting was not only its size, it was the feeling underneath it. Regret. The sense that everyone was now returning love to a woman who had already spent her last strength in front of them. It is one thing to admire an artist while they shine. It is another to realize, too late, how much pain they were carrying while they did it. Anita's funeral remains one of the defining mourning images in Hong Kong entertainment history because it captured both truths at once, the glory of what she meant and the sorrow of how she was lost. And yet Anita Mui's story refuses to remain only a tragedy. That is why she still matters. She left behind more than famous songs, famous films, and unforgettable costumes. She left behind a model of female power that was larger, riskier, and more emotionally complex than what many stars before her had been allowed to embody. She made the stage a place where femininity could be bold, wounded, erotic, rebellious, funny, and unbreakable all at once. She carried the spirit of Hong Kong in one body. Restless, stylish, resilient, theatrical, and haunted by the knowledge that glamour and pain often live side by side. That is why even after death, Anita Mui could not be buried in any simple sense. Her image stayed. Her voice stayed. Her final performances stayed. The sight of her standing in white, singing through illness, stayed. She became something more permanent than survival, memory with a heartbeat. Anita Mui did not just die of cancer. She turned her ending into one last performance, and Hong Kong never truly recovered from the final bow.